It was 50 years ago, June 17, 1972, that we first heard about Watergate, a nighttime break-in at Democratic Party headquarters in Washington's Watergate building complex by burglars seeking political secrets for President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. It led to Nixon's resignation, the only one by an American president so far, and to the term Watergate as a reminder of national shame and a reference point for political scandals, big and small, past, present, and still to come. The saga played out 10 years before the launch of the weekly Newsweek On Air radio broadcast I hosted for 3 decades. But on several occasions, we looked back with those more directly involved, most notably with Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and Katharine Graham, publisher of the Post and Newsweek. One conversation was prompted by a TV movie based on Woodward and Bernstein's book, The Final Days. So first Bob, and then Carl.
Happily, in making the movie, they stuck to the facts, and the facts establish the crimes, and the crimes are dealt with, particularly through the tapes, which kind of become a Greek chorus in the movie, and you see what he said, and you see what he did, and I think it makes it vividly clear that he resigned because he realized he was guilty.
I think what Richard Nixon did was unprecedented, and it was extraordinary, and you have to keep in mind that what he did was totally go against the oath of office he had taken to uphold the Constitution, and that we'd never had anything like that happen in our history before. And I think that this TV movie makes it clear the enormity of what he did in this regard. At the same time, and I think that indeed would it happen again today, that probably the same result would happen, that he would have to leave office. That what the movie does, as the book does, is that it shows an empathic view of the man's human situation. Here's the first man in our history trapped by his own acts and reacting to being closed in on. And it's at moments it's very sad and compelling, just as it was in the book that we wrote.
At that point, Woodward should have known better than to give Nixon much credit for appreciating his own guilt. The president's resignation was forced by Republican leaders warning they would not block impeachment and conviction. And Nixon subsequently repeatedly sought to downplay the Watergate cloud that shadowed him to the end. And here's what publisher Kay Graham told us.
Well, in general, when you have a story that is very exciting, it's exclusive for about 5 minutes. And then everybody piles on, and it's not exclusive anymore. And with Watergate, it was exclusive for June to more or less the end of the summer. I don't mean totally exclusive either, because thank heaven there were a few other publications, the Los Angeles Times and Time, and I can't remember, but there were moments when people came in, which were of great comfort. And finally in October, Walter Cronkite did 2 10-minute pieces on the air, and that was a great help because it took us national. So what made the pressure of being alone on it great was that you thought, if this is such a wonderful story, where is everybody else?
Carl Bernstein has talked about being concerned about his personal safety at one point, and I gather you were warned by some friends not to be alone, physically, literally. Can you recall those feelings?
Yeah, I didn't take that too seriously, to be honest. What I did take seriously was the threats made against the company. And those were threats against our television station licenses that made our stock plummet. And then there were other threats. They cut off access to everybody in the White House. They wouldn't answer our phones. They wouldn't let anybody come over here to editorial lunches. They wouldn't let anybody come to my house to dinner, which was not exactly the worst threat in the world. But it was sort of total. The role of the press was to keep the story alive when they were trying to hush it up. The thing that brought the president down was proper constitutional procedures, which was the courts and the grand juries, and finally the the committees of Congress. The role of investigative reporting clearly became more important, but I think that it was overdone for a while. I mean, I think everybody in the world, all the young people in the world, went to journalism school and wanted to investigate everything, and I think they overdid it. I think you have to investigate things. You have to be skeptical, but you shouldn't be vengeful, and you have to be fair, and you have to be careful.
Working for Kay was an honor and a pleasure, and she was key to the very existence of Newsweek On Air. The show grew out of a weekly guest spot for various Newsweek writers and reporters on New York radio station WMCA, owned by R. Peter Strauss of the Macy's family and Ellen Sulzberger Strauss of the New York Times family. And Ellen became furious when informed that we would be creating an independent national show for the old RKO radio network. She warned me that she would have to complain to Kay, her good friend on and off the tennis court, so I had to rush off a memo seeking Kay's okay. And bless her, the boss lady replied within days that of course we must make the leap and please keep her informed. More than that, she appeared on the show herself every time we asked. A footnote, after Ellen died, Peter married a woman I'd seen with him at some Manhattan gathering, Marsha Lewis, later more famous for her daughter by a previous marriage, Monica Lewinsky. Of course, it was Lewinsky, the tempting intern in Bill Clinton's White House, who prompted the next presidential scandal and an actual impeachment in 1998, though the majority of Americans never thought charges by independent counsel Ken Starr of lying about sex serious enough to merit removal from office. We talked about the Clinton episode with former Nixon aide John Ehrlichman, who went to jail for his role in the Watergate cover-up.
Are you surprised that this president can be disbelieved on this matter and yet supported more strongly than ever by the public?
Yes, although he's got a track record of having gotten away with this kind of thing in the past. So I think he has every right to rely on the acceptance of the American people.
You've said that you don't think the Clinton White House learned the painful lessons that the Nixon White House lived through, but as you say, the Stonewall seems to be working for them. What has been your personal reaction to this, all of this talk of impeachment and resignation once again, compared to what you had to live through yourself?
Well, of course, it's a very different fact pattern. I think there's an awful lot of horse feathers in the air. When you get right down to it, the special prosecutor has to be looking at obstruction of justice.
But in the end, even Starr seems to agree that he's not going to indict and try the president. It would have to go to impeachment, and there politics enters. And I wonder if these polls and the public atmosphere doesn't suggest that even if there were obstruction of justice, that being obstruction on this point, as opposed to all of the elements involved in Watergate, that Congress would not see fit to force either an impeachment or a resignation.
Well, it depends on the coverage. I doubt that there could have been an impeachment in the Watergate context if it had not been for that all summer long daily television exposure. And the Congress, as you say, is very slow to vote impeachment. And it takes a mobilization of public opinion and a sense of outrage to crystallize that.
Talk about morale among White House staffers. How does something like this affect them?
Well, they go around looking over their shoulder wondering what's true. The president doesn't talk to them, doesn't reassure them. I think there's a healthy shot of skepticism.
Indeed, according to Mike McCurry, there are those who really don't want to know, because if anybody thought they did know, they'd get subpoenaed and have to start getting lawyers' bills. Did you have anything like that during Watergate?
No, I don't recall any concern in that direction. We had a paucity of reassurance from the president. He did say he wasn't a crook and so on, but looking back on it, my big regret was that I didn't question him directly about some things that happened.
As expected, Clinton was impeached but not convicted, indeed finishing a full 2 terms in 2001 with the same top approval ratings as Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. In 2006, charges of corrupt lobbying and campaign donations reached all the way to the Bush White House, as did administration misinformation leading to the disastrous Iraq War, which led us to speak with Nixon White House counsel turned whistleblower John Dean, author of Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush.
There's something of an atmospheric change in Washington, but it's been evolving, and I think that what's happened is Bush and Cheney have sort of exacerbated the situation with their own approach to government, their secrecy, their refusal to have any transparency at the White House. It's created an atmosphere where that's justified and accepted now.
Talk about the similarities you see between Bush and Nixon in terms of personality. Nixon, of course, the only U.S. president to resign.
Well, I think that they're both clearly authoritarians, and they're men that knew and learned about the presidency from people they greatly respected. Nixon from Eisenhower, Bush from his father. And I've often sensed that neither man felt they quite filled the office like many presidents do.
Campaign finance reform that followed Watergate created problems of its own. What changes would you favor now in the way our system operates? Well,
the line between contributions and bribery is as fine as a frog's hair if I've ever seen. I'm never sure I'm able to distinguish the two. It obviously depends upon the intention of both parties. They're very difficult to prove, and we have clearly too much money involved in the process, and I just don't understand why the Supreme Court has gone so far in protecting, in the name of freedom of speech, the inability to regulate campaign finance.
You've written that the warrantless surveillance, a number of the national security actions that the Bush administration has taken are both beyond the law and you feel unconstitutional. Can you see in any realistic way this coming down to yet another impeachment and perhaps the next step?
I can't see it as long as the Republicans control the House, that's for certain. They have really been an extension of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I don't know what happened to institutional pride in the House. I used to work there, and I saw a very different body. What's the big problem is if the Republicans lose control in 2006, I say it's going to be Katie bar the door, and then anything could happen.
And what advice would you give for people who find themselves in the position that you were in Watergate, that is, in knowledge of bad actions, but now in an environment where there is a great deal of pressure coming down from the White House and the fear of national security investigations, prosecutions?
Well, I'm reading more and more reports, both journalistic and authors who have access about the abuses of power that are going on. The more that goes on, the more likely someone else is going to come forward like I did, who just really gets very uncomfortable with the situation.
We had learned the year before, 2005, that the primary whistleblower in Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein's Deep Throat, was former top FBI official Mark Felt, by then fairly far into dementia, but persuaded to reveal himself by his daughter for the sake of history and possible revenue to pay family debts. Woodward finally talked about it in a news conference and a later Washington Post video.
I was working for the Chief of Naval Operations, doing communications, boring work in the Pentagon, but Admiral Moore wanted somebody to take secret documents, top secret documents, to the White House. And on one trip, I was sitting there in chairs outside Henry Kissinger's office, or the offices of the National Security Council, and there was this white-haired man in a white shirt, which was unusual at that time. And I introduced myself as Lieutenant Woodward, and he said, "I'm Mark Felt, and what do you do?" And he was a high FBI official then, and so we're kind of two lost souls sitting there waiting for somebody in the NSC or Henry Kissinger or Al Haig to summon us. And so I asked about him. He was a lawyer and what he had done. And got his phone number, and later when Carl and I were working on the Watergate story, he's one of the people I called, and he was very worried about security, and so set up this mechanism, improbable as it sounded, but not to me at the time. I thought, okay, this is normal. You meet FBI people in an underground garage.
Carl Bernstein and I and others at the Washington Post kept our word. He was insistent that we not disclose, and I think we wanted to protect that principle.
We spoke with John Dean again in 2007 after the conviction of Louis Scooter Libby, top aide to Vice President Dick Cheney, on charges of obstructing justice and lying to a federal investigation of purposeful administration press leaks to support the Iraq War that included identifying a secret CIA operative. Libby's 30-month sentence was later commuted by President Bush, and he was fully pardoned even later by President Donald Trump. However, the investigation of those leaks was itself controversial for requiring grand jury testimony from several reporters, but Dean did not think it would seriously undermine future whistleblowing of the sort so key to Watergate.
I think this case was unique. I think that the prosecutor made a very good case as to why he needed the testimony of journalists in this instance. When you have a grand jury, you have a very unique situation. We learned in U.S. versus Nixon that not even presidents can invoke their privileges when you have grand juries involved and the criminal justice system at work. So I don't think it's a broad sweep of the privilege away from journalism, but rather narrow, and I don't think it's going to affect journalism one iota.
Will it affect, though, the kind of whistleblowing operations that journalism is dependent on?
I doubt it. Their whistleblowers come forward for multiple motives and reasons. They often have no relationship with the journalist. Sometimes they have a long-time relationship. Who's the classic now is obviously Deep Throat and Mark Felt, a very unique situation. He clearly had an agenda when he came forward and began leaking to Woodward.
Indeed, it was top-secret whistleblowing by Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman at the White House National Security Council that led to the first impeachment of President Trump for trying to leverage critical military supplies as pressure on Ukraine's president to announce an official investigation that would taint Joe Biden's race to replace Trump in the White House. Like his second impeachment after the January 6 assault on Congress, conviction was blocked by Republicans in the Senate, quite the opposite of Watergate.
The greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
Ex-President Nixon opening the audio version of his 1990 effort at explanation and redemption, or distraction as some saw it, In the Arena, a memoir of victory, defeat, and renewal from Simon & Schuster. It was nearly 16 years since he'd been forced from office by what then seemed the most extraordinary political event in American history. To put the new book in context, we spoke with Stanley Cutler, professor of history and law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and author of the upcoming book, The Wars of Watergate, from Knopf. Cutler also won the lawsuit against Nixon and the National Archives that released all the White House Watergate tapes, about which he was better versed than most, and with which he found Nixon's latest volume significantly at odds.
See, the fact is that so many of the things that are said there just do not jibe with the written documentary record as well as the tape record that we have. First of all, Nixon likes to say that he states very emphatically that one of the myths of Watergate is that he ordered the break-in. This is a typical Nixon ploy to say something that no one else is saying and accuse people, though, of having charged him with a particular crime. No one one that I know of, with one exception, I take that back, has charged Richard Nixon with ordering and plotting the break-in. Ironically, the only authoritative voice to have advanced that idea was none other than H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff. He did that in a book that he wrote about 10 years ago, all of which is to say that maybe someone will say anything in order to sell a book. That's one example. Then the business about the cover-up. He says that he didn't order a cover-up. Well, that's then to say that we shouldn't believe what we hear on the so-called smoking gun tape, the tape of June 23, 1972, in which Nixon and Haldeman talk over the idea of having Helms, Richard Helms, who was director of the CIA, tell the FBI to stay away from the story. The fact is that the transcript of that tape forced almost every Republican in the House of Representatives to announce that they would vote for impeachment in August 1974. And then it then verges on the comical, because Nixon in the new book wants to make Helms out to be some kind of hero for not carrying out his order. The fact is that Helms carried out the order for a few days, but then backed off. His backing off cost him dearly, because Richard Nixon fired him in November 1972.
What do you think the larger historical picture of Nixon is going to be?
Well, first of all, you're quite right describing all this as part of Richard Nixon's ongoing campaign for history. It's a campaign that begins the night before his resignation. I regard that speech as the opening salvo in his campaign for history. And you're also quite correct in saying that, in quoting Nixon, where he says that history will be kind to him, but historians won't be. I don't quite know what that means. I believe that Watergate is the spot that will not out. That textbooks in American history will always say, Richard Nixon, the first president of the United States to resign because of scandal, and then whatever else they may say. At times, I think he will be regarded very favorably for certain foreign policy achievements. Other times, he will not be. But the fact is that Watergate is the dominant note of this administration. There are antecedents of Watergate before the break-in. After all, John Mitchell, the president's attorney general, former law partner and close friend, is the one who testified in his Senate committee about the White House horrors, by which he meant the events that occurred before the Watergate break-in.
White House horrors was shorthand for a variety of criminal plans and actions before or related to the break-in and cover-up that sent scores of people to jail. They included breaking into the office of Pentagon Papers leaker Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, creation of the White House plumbers to use illegal wiretaps to spot and stop information leaks, Operation Gemstone to kidnap students who might disrupt the Republican convention in 1972, and to compromise Democratic politicians there with prostitutes. Also, Nixon orders to the IRS to audit the tax returns of Democratic National Committee Chairman Larry O'Brien and stop an investigation of Howard Hughes. Another expert who helped us see the role Watergate played in the continuing growth of an angry Republican right was Rick Perlstein, author of The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, from Simon & Schuster in 2014. Reagan's popularity helped insulate him from possible impeachment over the 1980s Iran-Contra scandal, secret government arms sales to Iran with the revenue aiding anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. But Perlstein wasn't surprised by the recurrence of impeachment talk after Barack Obama's re-election as president.
Certainly the impeachment thing didn't surprise me at all. I remember doing a radio interview with an NPR reporter who asked me what I expected from Obama's second term, and I said the Republicans will try to impeach him. And he was incredulous, and he said there's no way. But the fact of the matter is I've been writing since about 2007 that there are millions of Americans who don't consider Democrats in general and liberals in particular legitimate kind of partners in the governing of the country. That sort of extremism is one of the things that I'm tracing in this three-book series of mine. We discovered, I don't think any other historian has really written about this, that Ronald Reagan's response to Watergate was always either to dismiss it, saying it wasn't an important story, or to say that, well, most famously, a quote that really kind of got a lot of attention at the time, the Watergate not criminals at heart. Or sometimes you would even call Watergate a Democratic lynching, that the Democrats were trying to undo the results of the landslide of 1972, which, you know, kind of was nonsense because Watergate was this extraordinary moment of people from both parties coming together to investigate malfeasance, which was seen, at least among the elite, as kind of universally reviled. But the idea that Ronald Reagan was saying these things was seen as kind of a total impediment to his political rise. And what people didn't understand at the time was this kind of permission he was giving to his listeners.
It was a permission that furthered partisan polarization, extremist positions, and the disappearance of mutually agreed upon facts, historical, economic, scientific, that so endangers our politics and our national prospects today, 50 years since that break-in at the Watergate. Thank you.